September 1826, Batavia, New York. Late one night, a man walked out of a county jail. His name was William Morgan. Only minutes earlier, someone had paid off the tiny debt that had kept him behind bars. Morgan should have gone home. He never made it. Shortly after leaving the jail, several men seized him and forced him into a waiting carriage. The carriage disappeared into the darkness, heading north toward the Niagara frontier, and then William Morgan vanished. No confirmed grave, no proven cause of death, no final eyewitness account that explains exactly what happened to him. Nearly 2 centuries later, we still cannot reconstruct the final hours of his life with certainty, but everyone knew why his disappearance was explosive. Morgan had been preparing to publish a book, and that book threatened to expose the private rituals, passwords, hand signals, oaths, and ceremonies of one of the most famous brotherhoods in history, the Freemasons. Suddenly, this was no longer an ordinary missing person case. Was Morgan simply the victim of a local dispute? Was he kidnapped by angry members who wanted to silence him? Was he murdered because he knew too much? Or was the truth impossible to uncover because some of the people responsible for enforcing the law belonged to the same brotherhood? That last possibility terrified the public, because by the early 19th century, Freemasonry was no longer an obscure club of unknown men. Its members included businessmen, judges, military officers, politicians, and local officials. Men with money, men with access, men with influence. And Americans began asking a darker question. What happens when a secret society is no longer made up only of ordinary people? What happens when the judge, the businessman, the officer, and the politician all walk through the same closed door and call one another brother? Morgan's disappearance would ignite one of the largest anti-Masonic movements in American history. But he was not the first person to fear the Freemasons. Almost 90 years before Morgan vanished, one of the most powerful religious institutions on earth had already condemned them, the Vatican. Later, Freemasons would be accused of engineering the French Revolution, shaping the United States from behind the scenes, controlling international finance, manipulating governments, and hiding their symbols in plain sight. Most of those claims have never been supported by reliable evidence, but that does not make the real history harmless or simple. Because in 1981, more than a century and a half after Morgan disappeared, investigators in Europe really did uncover a secret membership list. Nearly 1,000 names, government officials, senior military officers, intelligence figures, bankers, businessmen, media executives, people embedded inside the machinery of the state. The organization connecting them had historical ties to Freemasonry. Its exposure helped bring down an Italian government, and soon afterward, a powerful banker connected to the same world would be found hanging beneath a bridge in London. Cash in his possession, bricks hidden inside his clothing. His death surrounded by questions that would remain unresolved for decades. So the real history of Freemasonry is not simply a story about ridiculous conspiracy theories. And it is not simply a story about an innocent fraternity unfairly misunderstood by the public. It is a story about secrecy, power, trust, and fear, and about what happens when ordinary people discover that influential men are meeting behind closed doors. To understand how that fear became so powerful, we have to go back centuries. Long before bankers, long before presidents, long before political scandals. The story may have started with something far more ordinary: stone, and the men who knew how to shape it. Travel back into medieval Europe. No skyscrapers, no modern cranes, no engineering software, no digital blueprints. Most people spend their entire lives close to the place where they were born. And yet, across Europe, enormous Gothic cathedrals began rising into the sky. Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Chartres Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, towering vaults, pointed arches, flying buttresses, massive stained glass windows, structures so complex that some took generations to complete. The men who built them were not simply laborers. The best stonemasons had to understand geometry, measurement, structural forces, design, and carving. They were craftsmen, engineers, architects, and artists at the same time. And because skilled masons were rare, they often traveled from one construction project to another. That created a practical problem. A stranger arrives at a cathedral site and claims to be an experienced mason. How do you know he is telling the truth? There is no national identification card, no professional licensing database, no centralized employment record. So working groups developed ways to identify skill, rank, and membership. Certain words, certain signs, certain grips, knowledge available only to craftsmen of a particular level. Today that sounds mysterious, but originally, it may have been surprisingly practical. A medieval form of professional authentication. The masons also gathered in buildings near the work site. They stored tools there, discussed plans, ate meals, and organized the project. Such a place became known as a lodge. At first, the lodge was simply that, a physical place. The mystery came later, because European society changed. The great age of cathedral construction faded. Fewer members of these lodges were actual working stonemasons. But the lodges did not disappear. Instead, another kind of man began walking through the door. Educated men, wealthy men, noblemen, merchants, military officers, scholars, gentlemen who had never spent their lives cutting stone. The tools remained, the rituals remained, the language remained, but their meaning changed. The square became a symbol of moral conduct. The compasses became a symbol of self-restraint. The lodge stopped being merely a workplace. It became a private social world. And that was the turning point. The stonemasons were fading away. The network survived. In 1646, the English antiquarian Elias Ashmole recorded in his diary that he had been admitted into a Masonic gathering. Ashmole was not a professional stonemason. He was an educated gentleman interested in history, science, astrology, and intellectual life. His admission is one of the clearest surviving signs that by the 17th century, Masonry was moving beyond the world of working craftsmen. The physical craft remained central to the symbolism, but the new members were no longer building cathedrals. They were using the language of architecture to discuss morality, knowledge, society, and the improvement of the individual. Then came one of the most famous dates in Masonic history. June 24, 1717, London. Representatives from 4 lodges gathered at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern, near St. Paul's Cathedral. There they formed a united Grand Lodge and selected Anthony Sayer as their first Grand Master. This event is generally treated as a major starting point of organized modern Freemasonry. 6 years later, in 1723, the constitutions of the Freemasons appeared. James Anderson, a Presbyterian minister, was closely associated with the work. The document gave Freemasonry 2 things: a mythology and a philosophy. Its legendary history tried to connect Masonry with ancient architecture, biblical traditions, and the distant origins of civilization. But the more important ideas were practical: moral conduct, brotherhood, knowledge, self-improvement, religious tolerance, and the belief that men from different backgrounds could enter the same lodge under a shared set of rules. To understand why that mattered, remember the Europe surrounding them. Catholics and Protestants had spent generations fighting over religion. Political loyalties were deeply tied to faith. Class divided society. Birth determined status. Outside the lodge, one man might be a nobleman and another a merchant. Their politics could separate them. Their religion could make them enemies. But inside the lodge, at least in principle, those differences were supposed to matter less. Members wore similar aprons. They followed the same ritual. They used the language of fraternity. They called one another brother. For an educated man in the 18th century, that could be enormously attractive. Freemasonry offered privacy, intellectual discussion, friendship, social connection, and access to other influential men. The lodges attracted merchants, military officers, intellectuals, government officials, and noblemen. And that created the problem that would follow Freemasonry for the next 300 years. The more influential the members became, the more suspicious outsiders became, because Freemasonry preserved one important tradition: secrecy. private signs, private ceremonies, initiation rituals, oaths, closed meetings. And if you were standing outside that door, the question was obvious. If nothing dangerous is happening inside, why does it need to be secret? That question eventually brought Freemasonry into direct conflict with the Roman Catholic Church. In 1738, Pope Clement XII issued a major papal condemnation of Freemasonry. From the Church's perspective, the danger was not difficult to understand. Men from different religious backgrounds were gathering privately. They were forming loyalties outside normal church authority. They were taking oaths, and they were refusing to reveal everything that happened in their meetings. For the Vatican, secrecy itself was part of the threat. If a Catholic man swore loyalty to a private brotherhood, what happened when that obligation conflicted with his religious duty? Who came first, the church or the lodge? The condemnation helped begin a long and complicated conflict between Catholic authorities and Freemasonry. But instead of destroying the organization, the hostility made it more mysterious. The logic was almost inevitable. If the Pope was warning people about the Freemasons, perhaps they really were powerful. If members had to swear secret oaths, perhaps those oaths were terrifying. And if outsiders were forbidden from watching the ceremonies, perhaps the ceremonies contained something dangerous. When descriptions of Masonic rituals began circulating outside the lodges, the public encountered imagery that seemed almost designed to provoke fear. Blindfolds, darkened rooms, ropes, sharp instruments, symbolic death, graves, resurrection, and at the center of one of Freemasonry's most famous traditions, a legendary murder. The murder of Hiram A. Biff. The best-known Masonic emblem is the square and compasses. Originally, they were ordinary tools. Within symbolic Freemasonry, they became moral lessons. The square represented upright conduct. The compasses represented restraint. A Mason was expected to control his behavior and keep his passions within proper limits. Nothing about that sounds particularly sinister. Then you encounter the ritual. Masonic tradition developed an elaborate legend around Hiram A. Biff, a figure associated with the building of the Temple of Solomon. In the ritual story, Hiram possesses the secret knowledge of a master mason. 3 lower-ranking workers want that secret. They confront him and demand the master's word. Hiram refuses. He is struck. He still refuses. He is struck again. Still, nothing. The 3rd attacker delivers the fatal blow. Hiram dies without giving up the secret. His body is hidden and later recovered. Within Masonic symbolism, the story becomes a lesson about loyalty, integrity, death, and rebirth. During ceremonies associated with the Master Mason degree, the candidate symbolically participates in Hiram's death and is later raised again, not literally, symbolically. A moral rebirth. But older ritual traditions contained other elements that disturbed outsiders even more. Candidates could enter in a deliberately vulnerable state, blindfolded, separated from ordinary possessions, guided through darkness, placed under psychological pressure, required to swear obligations before receiving further knowledge. And some older Masonic oath formulas contained extremely graphic descriptions of what should happen to a man who betrayed those obligations. A throat cut, a tongue torn out, a body opened, a heart removed. To a modern audience, the language sounds brutal, but an essential distinction has to be made. Symbolic penalties in ritual language are not proof that mainstream Freemasonry operated a secret execution system. There is no reliable evidence that ordinary Masonic organizations routinely murdered members for breaking ceremonial oaths. The punishments were symbolic, part of the ritual drama, part of an older culture of oath-taking. But imagine hearing those rumors in the early 19th century. You know, members swear frightening obligations. You know they promise to protect private knowledge. Then a man announces that he is going to reveal everything. The passwords, the signs, the rituals, the oaths. And shortly afterward, he disappears. William Morgan lived in Batavia, New York. He was not a powerful man, not a politician, not a banker, not a member of the elite. His finances were unstable, but Morgan claimed he had access to Masonic secrets, and he planned to publish them. He began working with a local printer named David C. Miller. Together they prepared a book exposing Masonic ritual. Word spread. Local Masons were furious. Morgan and Miller faced pressure. Attempts were made to interfere with the publication. The dispute escalated. Then Morgan was arrested. After various accusations, he was eventually held over a tiny debt. Only a few dollars. On the night of September 11, 1826, someone paid what he owed. Morgan walked out of jail, and men connected to Freemasonry took him away. He was transported toward the Niagara region. Then he vanished. This was enough to create a scandal. But the truly frightening question came next. Who was involved? Investigators established that several men involved in Morgan's abduction and transportation were Masons. Some participants were eventually convicted of kidnapping-related offenses, but the central mystery remained untouched. What happened after Morgan was taken away? Where was his body? Was he murdered? Who gave the order? Who carried it out? How far did responsibility go? No investigation ever answered those questions in a way that ended the controversy. Rumors exploded. Some claimed Morgan had been killed and thrown into the wire. Others proposed completely different scenarios. But politically, the most important fact was not whether every rumor could be proven. It was what people believed. And many Americans believed they were witnessing exactly what they had feared. A man threatened to expose a secret society. Members of that society abducted him. He disappeared, and that same organization included men with influence in law, business, and government. The public began asking, if too many powerful people belong to the same private brotherhood, can the truth ever be investigated honestly? The Morgan affair triggered a massive anti-Masonic movement. Newspapers attacked the fraternity. Public meetings spread. Political candidates were questioned about membership. Men publicly renounced their lodges. Some lodges closed. Fear of Freemasonry became a national political force. The Anti-Masonic Party emerged. Its purpose was simple: fight what its supporters believed was the hidden political influence of Freemasonry. In 1831, the party held a national presidential nominating convention, an important development in the evolution of American party politics. Think about what had happened. A private fraternity, a kidnapping, a missing man, and public fear of hidden influence. Together, they had become powerful enough to change American politics. But even William Morgan did not create the most enduring myth surrounding Freemasonry. The idea that the organization belonged to a global conspiracy came from another story, and another secret society. The Illuminati. May 1, 1776. Bavaria. A university professor named Adam Weishaupt created a secret organization. Weishaupt was deeply influenced by Enlightenment thought. He opposed what he regarded as excessive religious authority, censorship, and political absolutism. The organization eventually became known as the Bavarian Illuminati. The historical Illuminati looked nothing like the supernatural organization of modern conspiracy culture. There was no immortal council running civilization. No hidden command center controlling celebrities, banks, and governments. The real Bavarian Illuminati was a radical Enlightenmentary secret society interested in reason, education, secular thought, and political reform. But Weishaupt had a problem. A secret movement needs a network. Trusted recruits, influential contacts, people with money and access. In 18th century, Europe already had such a network. Freemasonry. Masonic lodges contained educated men, noblemen, government officials, military officers, and wealthy merchants. One of the most important figures in the Illuminati's expansion was the German nobleman Adolf von Knigge. Knigge had Masonic connections. Under his influence, the Illuminati recruited increasingly from Masonic circles and borrowed elements from existing fraternal structures. This is where history becomes important. The Illuminati and Freemasonry genuinely did intersect, but they were not the same organization. The Freemasons did not simply become the Illuminati. The Illuminati did not secretly control every Masonic lodge. They were separate networks with some overlapping members. That distinction matters. But to outsiders, the overlap was enough. During the 1782s, the Bavarian government cracked down on secret societies. Homes were searched. Documents were seized. Internal materials were published. Members were exposed. Adam Weishaupt fled. The historical Bavarian Illuminati collapsed. Its life had been remarkably short. That should have been the end of the story. A radical secret society appears. The government discovers it. The organization is suppressed. Its founder runs. The movement dies. Then Europe exploded. The French Revolution. The Bastille was stormed. The monarchy collapsed. Church property was seized. Aristocrats fled. King Louis XVI was executed. Violence escalated into the Reign of Terror. To the ruling elites of Europe, it looked like the world was coming apart. One of the continent's great monarchies had fallen. A king had been killed. The church had lost enormous power. A social order that had survived for generations seemed to collapse in only a few years. People wanted an explanation. The real answer was complicated. Government debt, food prices, class tension, political paralysis, Enlightenment philosophy, institutional failure, popular anger, historical accident. That was messy. Then another explanation appeared, a much simpler one. It had all been planned. In the late 1792s, writers including the French priest Augustin Barruel and the Scottish scholar John Robison published influential works connecting Enlightenment thinkers, Freemasonry, the Illuminati, and revolutionary politics. Their argument was explosive. The French Revolution had not simply happened. Secret societies had engineered it. Freemasonry had provided the network. The Illuminati had provided radical ideas. Revolutionaries had carried out the plan. This theory had one enormous advantage. It made history easy. Financial crisis. You do not need to understand it. Class conflict. Forget it. Political collapse. There is already an answer. Someone was behind it. That is one of the most seductive things about conspiracy thinking. It turns chaos into design. Terrible events stop being random. They become intentional. Someone planned them. Someone benefited. Someone was in control. There was only one problem. There is no reliable evidence that the suppressed Bavarian Illuminati secretly orchestrated the French Revolution. There is also no credible evidence that Masonic lodges across Europe received orders from a single hidden command directing the revolution. But by then, the story was more powerful than the evidence. The modern template had been created. Hidden elites, secret societies, political revolution, invisible coordination. From that point forward, whenever a government fell, a war began, a financial system crashed, or a famous political figure died, the same questions could return. Where were the Freemasons? Where were the Illuminati? Who was really behind it? And nowhere would those questions become more powerful than in the new republic across the Atlantic. Because George Washington really was a Freemason. Benjamin Franklin was a Freemason. Paul Revere was a Freemason. Several important figures in the Revolutionary and early Republican period had documented Masonic connections. So saying Freemasonry had absolutely nothing to do with the social world surrounding the founding of the United States would also be misleading. It did. Freemasonry connected influential men. It created relationships. It existed inside the wider culture of the Enlightenment. And some of the most famous members of the founding generation participated openly. The clearest example came on September 18, 1793. The cornerstone ceremony for the United States Capitol. George Washington attended. The ceremony included unmistakable Masonic elements, Masonic clothing, ceremonial tools, cord, wine, oil, traditional symbolic acts associated with laying a cornerstone. This was not a ritual uncovered by investigators in a secret basement. It was public. The first president of the United States openly participated in Masonic tradition at the symbolic foundation of one of the country's most important buildings. For conspiracy theorists, that fact appears devastating. Washington was a Mason. Franklin was a Mason. The Capitol had a Masonic cornerstone ceremony. So what about the money? What about the pyramid? What about the eye? The most famous supposed evidence appears on the $1 bill. An unfinished pyramid. Above it, an eye surrounded by rays of light. The Eye of Providence. Below it, the Latin phrase novus, or Deus seclorum, commonly understood as referring to a new order of the ages. To a modern audience raised on conspiracy culture, the design looks almost too perfect. A pyramid, a watching eye, ancient language, a phrase about a new order. But the timeline changes the story. The pyramid and Eye of Providence come from the reverse of the Great Seal of the United States. Congress approved the design in 1782, and the Eye of Providence was not an exclusively Masonic symbol. Similar imagery existed in Christian art long before modern conspiracy theories. It represented divine watchfulness. Another important detail is often forgotten. The Great Seal had existed since the 18th century, but the famous reverse design did not appear on the $1 bill until 1935. So the object most often presented as proof of a centuries-old Masonic financial conspiracy is actually a 20th century banknote using an 18th century national emblem, built partly from older religious imagery. Freemasons have used eye symbolism. That is true. But the symbol alone does not prove that the United States government was secretly controlled by Masonry. And this is how many conspiracy theories become convincing. Start with something real. George Washington was a Freemason. True. The Capitol Cornerstone ceremony used Masonic ritual. True. The Eye of Providence appears on American currency. True. Freemasonry has used similar symbols. Also true. Then make one final jump. Therefore, a secret Masonic command center has controlled the United States for centuries. That is where the evidence disappears. The more accurate conclusion is less sensational, but more interesting. Freemasonry genuinely belonged to the social world of the American founding era. Some major founders were members. Masonic networks connected influential men. The fraternity's ideas about brotherhood, moral improvement, religious tolerance, and Enlightenment thought fit naturally into that historical environment. But none of this proves the existence of a unified secret government controlling the United States. History supports the first claim. It does not support the second. And this is where the story should have become simple. We could stop here and say that Freemasonry's reputation was built from fear, symbolism, coincidence, and human imagination. That powerful secret networks were mostly a fantasy. That people had spent centuries connecting dots that weren't ever connected. Then, in 1981, police opened the files of a man named Licio Gelli, and suddenly, the conspiracy stopped looking entirely imaginary. Italy. Investigators were following the financial activities surrounding the controversial banker Michele Sindona. The trail eventually led them to property connected to Licio Gelli. Gelli was not simply another businessman. He was the central figure behind a secret organization called Propaganda Due. The organization had historical connections to Italian Freemasonry, but by the late 20th century, Propaganda Due had become something profoundly different from an ordinary lodge. It had become a hidden political network. Investigators searched Gelli's property and found a list, nearly 1,000 names. When the list became public, Italy erupted. These were not simply old men gathering for private dinners. The names included parliamentarians, government officials, senior military officers, police officials, intelligence leaders, bankers, businessmen, and media figures. People positioned close to the political, military, financial, and informational centers of the country. The question was no longer, why do these men enjoy secret rituals? The question became, why are so many powerful people inside a democratic state secretly connected to the same network? The scandal spread rapidly. Senior officials came under scrutiny. Political pressure intensified. Prime Minister Arnaldo Forlani's coalition government collapsed. Parliament established a special commission to investigate Propaganda Due. How deeply had it penetrated state institutions? Had members used public office to help one another? Was it influencing government activity? Did the network represent a structure of power operating outside normal democratic accountability? This was no longer a pamphlet written by a conspiracy theorist. No pyramid on a banknote. No centuries-old rumor. There was a list. There were names. Government officials. Military officers. Intelligence figures. Bankers. Media executives. Propaganda Due was real. Its network was real. and its exposure created a real political crisis. But another distinction matters. Propaganda Do was not global Freemasonry. The existence of one secretive, politicized and corrupted network with Masonic connections does not prove that every lodge in every country receives orders from the same hidden headquarters. That would simply recreate the same logical mistake made by conspiracy theories. But Propaganda Do demonstrated something far more important. Secret elite networks are not imaginary by definition. They can exist. Powerful people can create hidden systems of loyalty. Private relationships can overlap with public authority. Secrecy can conceal conflicts of interest. And when politics, banking, intelligence, business, and private allegiance begin to overlap, the consequences can be dangerous. Then the story became darker, because one of the men connected to this world was a banker. His name was Roberto Calvi. Calvi became chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's major private banks. The bank also had important financial relationships connected to the Vatican's financial world. Because of those connections, newspapers gave Calvi a nickname, God's Banker. He was also connected to Propaganda Do. By the early 1980s, Banco Ambrosiano was collapsing under the weight of an extraordinarily complicated financial structure. Offshore companies, international transfers, massive financial gaps, regulatory investigations, political relationships, religious financial institutions, private networks. Everything seemed to overlap. Calvi's position became increasingly dangerous. In 1982, he left Italy. He traveled to London. Then came the morning of June 18, Blackfriars Bridge. A body was seen hanging from scaffolding beneath the bridge. The dead man was Roberto Calvi. There was a rope around his neck. He had significant amounts of cash in his possession. Bricks had been placed inside his clothing. At first, British investigators considered suicide. But almost immediately, questions appeared. Why Blackfriars Bridge? Why the bricks? Why the money? How had Calvi reached the location? What exactly happened during the final hours of his life? And why had one of Europe's most controversial bankers, connected to a collapsing financial empire and a secret political network, ended up dead beneath the London Bridge? The case refused to stay simple. The original suicide interpretation was challenged. Further investigations followed. Later forensic inquiries reopened the possibility that Calvi had been murdered. Italian prosecutors eventually pursued a murder case. Several people were put on trial. Theories connected Calvi's death to organized crime, financial disputes, political interests, Propaganda Do, and other networks. But in 2007, the defendants accused of participating in his murder were acquitted because the evidence was insufficient. And so the question survived. Who killed Roberto Calvi? Or more carefully, can we even establish every detail of how his death occurred with complete certainty? This is where conspiracy theories become almost irresistible. A powerful banker, a collapsing financial empire, the Vatican, a secret political network, organized crime allegations, a mysterious journey to London, a body beneath a bridge, bricks in his clothing, cash in his possession, and no final explanation capable of satisfying everyone. Mafia involvement, financial enemies, political interests, people connected to Propaganda Do, some other force. Many theories have been proposed. None has been proven strongly enough to turn speculation into certainty. And this is exactly why cases like Calvi's matter. When evidence leaves an empty space, the human mind hates leaving it empty. We fill it with a story. And secret societies are among the most powerful stories ever created. So now we can finally return to the question that has followed Freemasonry for 3 centuries. Do the Freemasons secretly control global finance? Presidents, governments, wars, banks, intelligence agencies, and political revolutions? Based on the historical evidence we can verify, no. There is no reliable evidence of a single global Masonic command structure operating across centuries and issuing coordinated instructions to presidents, generals, bankers, intelligence chiefs, governments, and media organizations. The real world is not that organized. Freemasonry itself is divided across countries, jurisdictions, traditions, and Grand Lodges. There is no single hidden control room directing them all. There is no credible evidence that a Masonic headquarters ordered the French Revolution. There is no reliable evidence that the Bavarian Illuminati survived underground for more than 2 centuries and secretly directs modern politics. The eye of providence on American currency is not proof that Freemasonry controls the United States. And the fact that famous American founders were Freemasons does not prove that the country was designed as a secret Masonic state. But we can make the opposite mistake too. We can hear all of that and decide that every concern about secret networks is absurd. History does not support that conclusion either. Powerful people do form private networks. Friendship becomes influence. Business relationships become political relationships. Officials hide information. Institutions protect themselves. People with shared interests help one another. And when power operates without transparency, abuse becomes possible. Propaganda do prove that secret elite networks can exist. The William Morgan affair showed something else. Private loyalty can collide with public responsibility. And when members of a closed brotherhood decide that protecting one another matters more than accountability to the outside world, suspicion becomes rational. The mistake is not asking questions. The mistake is deciding the answer before the evidence exists. And that may be the real reason Freemasonry has fascinated people for so long. It combines 3 things human beings find almost impossible to ignore: secrecy, power, and identity. Imagine being an ordinary citizen. You know judges, businessmen, military officers, politicians, and wealthy men are meeting in a room you cannot enter. They use private rituals. They recognize one another through signs and symbols. They call one another brother, and you have no idea what happens after the door closes. Of course, you are going to ask what they are discussing. But the more important question is this: when they walk back out, do they help one another? That is not a ridiculous question. It is a reasonable one. The problem begins when we move from powerful people may use private networks. Therefore, one secret organization controls everything. Those are not the same claim. In reality, power rarely looks like hooded figures standing around candles and deciding the future of civilization. Real power is less theatrical, and often much harder to see. Relationships, money, information, access, loyalty, favors, reputation, professional networks, and shared interests. None of those things require a secret council ruling the planet, but together, they can shape governments, companies, institutions, and entire societies. Perhaps that is why the most successful conspiracy theories are rarely built entirely from lies. They are built from fragments of truth. A real missing man, William Morgan. Real secret rituals. A real president who was a Freemason, George Washington. A real Masonic cornerstone ceremony at the United States Capitol. A real Bavarian Illuminati. A real anti-Masonic political movement. A real secret membership list in Italy. A real network called Propaganda Do. A real banker, Roberto Calvi. A real body hanging beneath a bridge in London. Put those facts on a table. Then look at the empty space between them. That empty space is where the story grows. Connect one fact to another, then another. Ignore the missing evidence. Replace uncertainty with intention. Replace coincidence with design. Replace chaos with control. And eventually, a story appears that can explain almost anything. Wars, revolutions, financial collapses, political deaths, governments, currency, religion, media, history itself. And once a theory becomes that large, it develops a strange kind of armor. If evidence is missing, the conspirators must have hidden it. If documents cannot be found, they must have been destroyed. If officials deny the theory, the denial becomes proof that they are involved. If an investigation finds nothing, the conspiracy must be even more powerful than anyone imagined. At that point, the theory no longer needs evidence. It protects itself. And perhaps that is the greatest power Freemasonry has ever possessed. Not the power to control the world, the power to control the imagination. In 1826, William Morgan walked out of a jail in New York and disappeared. We still cannot reconstruct every moment that followed. In 1982, Roberto Calvi was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. Decades of investigations and trials never produced an explanation accepted by everyone. Those mysteries remain, but one thing is certain. As long as there is a closed door, and powerful people are sitting behind it, and everyone outside that room has no idea what they are discussing, stories about organizations like the Freemasons will never completely disappear. Because what human beings fear most is not simply a secret. It is a secret, held by someone more powerful than they are.